I'm Tom from Do-It-Yourself Home Automation, and this is a look at how green of a cooking method the Instant Pot is. So I've shown I love the Instant Pot because it's basically an automatic pressure cooker, and it really makes it easy to automatically cook large amounts of food that you can use for meal prep, to have your meals pretty much automated during the week, so you can do a big batch of food in here, and you can cook dishes that would take hours or even a whole day in a slow cooker, and you can do it in 10 or 15 minutes in the Instant Pot because it's cooking under pressure. And obviously it's an electric appliance, so one thing I'm wondering with this is this a green way of cooking? And I think the biggest question that sort of leads to is, well, how much power does it use to cook a full meal, and how does that compare ultimately to how much natural gas you would use cooking something on the stove, how much energy would you use to cook something the conventional way. So because this is, cooking everything under pressure, is it a more efficient way to cook? Are you using less power and thus is it greener? Or is it, going to end up using a ton of power to do that same amount of cooking because it has to pressurize the whole can? So we're going to look at how much power it uses at different stages in the cooking process, and we can try to figure out from that how green of a cooking method this is relative to some others. So I'm going to get started here and put this onto saute, but first I'll just show how I have this hooked up. So this is my Instant Pot. This is the larger model of Instant Pot, and then I've got this plugged into a kilowatt over here at the outlet, and you can see at idle it's drawing 0.3 watts. So that's sort of the vampire load that it's drawing, even when it's just plugged in and not being used. I think that's pretty reasonable. That's a very small amount of power overall, and it's probably just powering the little digital display and some of the basic circuitry in the device. So now I'm going to put it onto the first setting that you usually use in an Instant Pot recipe, which is saute. And I'm going to say to start there. So we'll let that start up. And let's take a look at what our power draw is here as this starts to actually go. So you can see it jumps up pretty rapidly, and it's using 1176 watts. So that's a serious power draw. That's around what you would expect from a microwave or a large space heater. And that makes sense because, it's pretty aggressively heating up the inside of this device at the moment. So yeah, 1183 watts, pretty serious juice. Let's see as it gets up to pressure and does the other parts of the cooking process, how that looks. So now I'm actually going to start my dish, which is going to be a nice lentil soup. I'm going to pause this and we'll take a look in at later stages in this process. Okay, so now I've got a nice mirepoix going in there, and let's have a look at the draw here. So we're still at 1168 watts, and then let's just check in. I'm going to switch it over to the total power draw so far, which is 0.12 kilowatt hours so far getting to this part in the recipe. So now I'm going to continue making my soup, and we'll check back in. Okay, I've got all my ingredients in here now. You can see it's still drawing about the same amount, 1174 watts at the moment, and the total draw so far we're up to about a quarter of a kilowatt hour. So things that strike me so far in this process are that the draw seems to be pretty constant throughout the cooking process. It's not really going up and down that much, and then I'm going to see when I actually put it on instead of saute, if I'm putting it on the pressure cook setting, if it's going to change the actual amount that it's drawing. My guess is that it won't. My guess is that it's basically an on or off kind of situation, and to get it up to pressure, it's probably going to leave the pot on the entire time and continue to draw the same amount. So let's put the lid on and we will see. Okay, so this is interesting. I put the lid on, set this onto the pressure cooking setting, which is what you use to cook under pressure in the pot for a long time period, and I put this on for a 15-minute pressurization cooking. And looking at the draw here, you can see from the saute function to where we are now, we're now at 0 watt, basically 0.3. So basically essentially 0 watts, even though this is on and is in theory coming up to pressure. And I find that to be pretty interesting. Obviously if it's actively trying to pressurize, why is it not actually drawing any power, which would mean that it's not actually heating. And the only thing I can think of is if it knows already that the liquid in there is pretty hot from the sautéing process, it knows maybe that it's going to start to get to a certain pressure naturally, just from the heat of that and the evaporation of steam off of it. So maybe it's going to wait, and actually I see it's just now, after about maybe 3 minutes, it's kicked in and started to heat. So I'm wondering if it's sort of harvesting some of that natural heat from the saute process to begin pressurizing, because it is monitoring the internal pressure on the pot in theory, so it should know if it's actively pressurizing even without heat. So that's sort of an interesting thing to see. It's not what I expected. I expected that as soon as I put it onto pressure cook, it would just fire up that heating element, draw its full wattage, and try to get as hot as possible as quickly as it could. But it actually seemed to know that it was already pretty hot in the pot, and maybe waited until it could make maximum use of the residual heat from the saute before it actually started to heat again. So that's sort of a smart function. I can see it might be trying to get a particular target temperature inside the pot to pressurize completely, and if it was already above that temperature, it probably was waiting to get down to that temperature again, assuming that it was already pressurizing just from that heat from the saute. So kind of a cool thing to see there, and that obviously saves a bit of power. But now that it's probably dropped back down and it's no longer so hot from the saute, the heating element is kicked back on, and it'll probably stay at that level, I imagine, until the pot gets back up to pressure. So let's see where it goes from here. Okay, the pot is still working on coming up to pressure at this point, and if you use an Instant Pot, you know that that can sometimes be the most time-consuming part of the process. The actual pressure cooking, when it's at full pressure, is whatever time you specify. In this case, I did 15 minutes, but it can take a lot longer, especially with a soup or something where there's a lot of liquid, to actually get to pressure. So far it's used almost half of a kilowatt hour just in the saute and the process of coming up to pressure. So I'll keep taking a look at this. Okay, so the pot has finally come up to pressure here, and you can see we're at 15 minutes on here, so it's going to now count down as it stays at that full pressure. And let's take a look at where we are at the moment. So this is the kilowatt hour. Let's take a look at the draw right now. So at the moment, it's not really drawing that much power, which makes me think that it's waiting until the temperature dips a little bit in here and just sort of trying to maintain the pressure in the pot, which is interesting. Again, I would think it would be on kind of full blast all the time, but I guess that would probably bring it to too high of a pressure. So it's actually cycling on and off, probably now that it's at pressure, to maintain that high cooking pressure in here. And then let's take a look at, again, the total draw, so 0.68 kilowatt hours. And that's just to get up to pressure at this point. So my guess is that as this finishes out its cooking process, and it goes through this full 15 minutes of cycling on and off, we're probably going to end up at somewhere around 1 kilowatt hour total for cooking this dish. But 0.68 now for what we've done so far, another 15 minutes, maybe a little bit of time with the keep warm setting. Yeah, we're probably going to end up around 1 kilowatt hour total. So what does that mean overall? Well, in terms of the actual cost of doing this, it's pretty reasonable. So even with really high electric rates during peak times here in California, we're getting charged about 32 cents per kilowatt hour. So assuming this ends up around 1 kilowatt hour for the whole cooking process, basically it costs 32 cents to cook this dish. And again, that's really pretty good when you consider that this particular recipe serves 16 portions. So the cost per portion for the electricity used to do this cooking is pretty much negligible. And then in terms of an environmental cost, so, really the question of how green is this as a cooking method comes down to how green is your electricity. So 1 kilowatt hour in one place can be, 0 CO2 emissions, for example, because, if your power is being generated by solar and wind, there's going to be no CO2 emissions associated with that kilowatt hour. If you live in a place where most of your power is coming from coal or another dirtier source, then you might have a lot higher emissions from that. But the average in the United States, at least, is 1.004 pounds of CO2 per kilowatt hour of electricity. So if this ends up drawing about 1 kilowatt hour to do the full cooking process for this dish, then that means that cooking this dish has emitted 1 pound, just about 1 pound of CO2. So, again, as we see a move towards more renewables, then you're probably going to see, almost no environmental impact. And that's one of the great things here is that, if I was cooking on the old stove over here with natural gas, then there'd be a constant use here, and it's a fossil fuel, so I'd literally be burning that, and there's really no way to make that clean ultimately. Over here, though, with the Instant Pot, because it is electric, as we see a shift towards more renewables, that kilowatt hour of electric use could eventually trend towards emitting nothing. So I think this is a very green way of cooking ultimately. 16 portions of food, 1 kilowatt hour of power to create that. Cost-wise, it's basically negligible. A few cents per portion, basically. Even in California with very high rates, and 1 pound of CO2, kind of in an average scenario. But again, if you have solar panels on your roof, or you're subscribing to an electric provider that gives you more renewable power, then you may not be emitting anything by doing this style of cooking, which is something you can never say for good old natural gas. So if you found this helpful in any way, please subscribe to my channel. It really helps.